Evidence that the Bible has been corrupted. Part 2. The mystery of the ending of Mark's Gospel. Most Bibles have chapter 16, verses 9 to 20, known as the longer ending. Some have a shorter ending with verses 9 and 10, and some end at verse 8. The 1611 King James Bible has the longer ending. Codex Sinaiticus from the mid-4th century ends at verse 8. Biblical scholars have given 4 explanations for the acceptance of one or more of the different endings for the Gospel. Number 1. The author of Mark ended it abruptly at verse 8 for whatever reason. Number 2. The longer ending is preferred due to it being in some early manuscripts. Number 3. The shorter ending is preferred due to it being in other early manuscripts. And number 4. The actual ending of the Gospel has been lost. Exhibit A. The principal Constantinopolitan and Alexandrian manuscripts has the longer endings of verses 9 to 20. As such, early English translations of the Bible have the longer ending, like Wycliffe's English translation of 1380, Tyndale's Bible of 1534, Cranmer Bible of 1539, Geneva Bible of 1557, Reims Bible of 1582, and so on. So what does modern biblical scholarship say about this? Exhibit B. Scofield King James Study Bible states, quote, "The passage from verse 9 to the end is not found in the 2 most ancient manuscripts, the Sinaitic and Vatican, and others have it with partial omissions and variations." Exhibit C. The New International Version Study Bible states, quote, "Serious doubt exists as to whether these verses belong to the Gospel of Mark. They are absent from important early manuscripts and display certain peculiarities of vocabulary, style, and theological content that are unlike the rest of Mark. His Gospel probably ended at verse 8, or its original ending has been lost." End of quote. Exhibit D. The Nelson's New King James Study Bible states, quote, "The authenticity of these last 12 verses has been disputed. Those who doubt Mark's authorship of this passage point to 2 4th century manuscripts that omit these verses." End of quote. However, quote, "This passage is endorsed by such early church fathers as Justin Martyr, Titian, and Irenaeus." Exhibit E. Quote, "The most reliable early manuscripts conclude the Gospel of Mark at verse 8. End of quote. Exhibit F. The New Bible Commentary says, quote, "It seems that verses 9 to 20 is made up of 2 attempts to complete the story. These are largely made up of details taken from other Gospels or Acts, with a few additions from early church traditions as well. They cannot be said to be part of the Scriptures." End of quote. Exhibit G. The Revised Standard Version and Harper Study Bible states, quote, "Other ancient authorities add after verse 8 the following, quote, "But they report briefly to Peter and those with him all that they had been told. And after this, Jesus himself sent out by means of them from east to west the sacred and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation." End of quote. Exhibit H. The Nat Bible says, quote, "Jerome and Eusebius knew of almost no Greek manuscripts that had this longer ending. Several manuscripts have marginal comments noting that earlier Greek manuscripts lacked the verses, while others mark the text with asterisks and obeli, symbols that scribes used to indicate that portion of the text being copied was spurious. Internal evidence strongly suggests the secondary nature of both the short and longer endings. End of quote. Exhibit I, the Wycliffe Bible Commentary states, quote, in the two most trustworthy manuscripts of the Greek New Testament, the Vaticanus and the Sinaiticus, the Gospel ends with verse 8, as does also in several early versions. Both Eusebius and Jerome state that the ending was missing from most of the manuscripts of their day. By far, the greater number of manuscripts have a longer conclusion, but many of them are of a late date and an inferior quality. By the recognized standards of textual evaluation, both the longer and shorter endings must be rejected, and this is the judgment of almost all textual scholars. End of quote. Exhibit J, the New Oxford Annotated Bible of the New Revised Standard Version states, some of the most ancient authorities bring the book to a close at the end of verse 8. One authority concludes the book with a shorter ending. Others include the shorter ending and then continue with verses 9 to 20. In most authorities, verses 9 to 20 follow immediately after verse 8, though in some of these authorities the passage is marked as being doubted. End of quote. Exhibit K, the New World Translation of the Holy Scriptures says, quote, certain ancient manuscripts and versions add the long conclusion, and some late manuscripts and versions contain a short conclusion after verse 8. End of quote. Exhibit L, the Devotional Bible New Century Version says, quote, verses 9 to 20 are not included in the two best and oldest Greek manuscripts of Mark. End of quote. Exhibit M, the Recovery Version says, quote, many ancient manuscripts omit verses 9 to 20. End of quote. Exhibit N, the Interpreter's Commentary of the Bible says, quote, verses 9 to 20, later editions. Two attempts to supply a substitute for the missing ending of Mark have come down to us. A, the longer ending appears in almost all the later manuscripts. B, the shorter ending, found only rarely in the later manuscripts, is obviously a late editorial addition to give the gospel a satisfactory conclusion. Conclusion. Number 1. The long and short endings are rejected as they are not found in the most ancient and reliable manuscripts. Number 2. The fact that endings harmonize Mark with the other synoptic gospels gives evidence for their insertion at a later date. Number 3. Unlike the Comma Johanneum, this interpolation occurred much earlier and is still included in many modern Bible versions today.